This lecture is on the Indian boarding schools, and rather than start from the beginning, since I've already done the first 10 to 15 minutes of the lecture, I'm going to skip ahead to where I left off. So, introduction. I think I left off talking about the Dawes Act. Okay, this is where I was. So, at the founding of the Carlisle Indian Boarding School in 1879, the U.S. government launched its program of Indian boarding schools. In 1899, there were 25 residential boarding schools in operation in the United States. And at the boarding schools, sex segregation was strictly enforced, which generated different school experiences for girls and boys. Indian boarding schools were established first and foremost to assimilate Indian children into white American society, thereby obliterating the cultural heritage of Indian youth. Historian David Adams concludes in his book Education for Extinction, American Indians and the Boarding School Experience, 1875 to 1928, quote, "The white man concluded that the only way to save Indians was to destroy them, that the last great Indian war would be waged against children. They were coming for the children." So many people now refer to these efforts as a cultural genocide. So cultural genocide, Indian children were sent to boarding schools for years, many losing their ability to speak their native languages and unable to regularly visit their parents or native communities. The Indian boarding schools were established to destroy Indian cultural traditions in an effort to quote unquote civilize them. But the story is more complicated than just that, because Native Americans resisted, they actively reclaimed their native cultural traditions, and they also formed a pan ethnic Indian identity across different tribes because children from multiple tribes attended the schools. So this basically means when I say pan ethnic Indian identity, I mean that different tribes came together in one place, they learned about each other, and they started to identify with each other as Native American under bad conditions. So, in addition to identifying with their individual tribes, they were beginning to identify as Native Americans because of the ways that they were oppressed. So, the question is, why were the boarding schools intent on eliminating Native American culture? One reason was that white society viewed Native American family life as inferior to Anglo American families. For instance, one author, in his 1876 History of the American Nation, described Indian society in the following terms, quote, "The Indian was a barbarian. Labor he considered degrading and fit only for women. His squaw therefore built his wigwam, cut his wood, and carried his burdens when he journeyed. While he hunted or fished, she cleared the land and dressed the skins." So these ideas about Indian family life made the boarding schools institutions established for the purpose of shaping Native American women and Native American families more generally into the American mold of what proper gender roles and family life should look like. So one Indian mother worried that, quote, "education and civilization would make her child look upon her as a savage." So many Native Americans were forced to send their children to boarding schools, and this is why they went, why the children actually attended the boarding schools. So there was a compulsory attendance law that was passed in 1891, after which rations and other goods, so food goods, were withheld from families if they refused to send their children to these boarding schools. Also, at the same time that this compulsory attendance law was passed, there was a movement to educate Indian girls in particular that reflected the new trends in women's education. So, women's education is, women are increasingly being educated in the 19th century in contrast to earlier periods of time. So, the Industrial Revolution of the late 19th century produced a demand for vocational preparation for women. The new school discipline of domestic science, a modern homemaking technique developed to bring scientific management, or what they called scientific management, to the American family and provide skills to the increasing number of women entering the workforce. So, in other words, they're trying to make domestic home life domestic labor more efficient, and that's what I mean when I say scientific management. So most boarding schools were rarely located close to Native American communities. And this was because they were trying to prevent children and parents from being easily able to visit each other. That way, children could more easily distance themselves from their native customs and traditions. This also meant that the trip to the boarding schools was often traumatic for the children because they didn't know when they would see their families again. So there were many boarding schools, with the Carlisle school being the most well-known example because it was the first, but there are others like, in California, there's the Sherman Institute, was the most well-known. It was in Riverside, California. Much of the instruction at the boarding schools was standardized. So you could look at individual boarding schools, but across the boarding schools, there's a pretty standardized way of approaching education. Let's look at a day in the life of a student at the boarding schools. So, first of all, they lived by the bells, sort of militaristic, right? The bells, indicated what their next task was in their day. Indian girls and boys were taught strict obedience because Americans thought that the idea of obedience was foreign to the native mind. So, and that discipline was a corollary to civilization. So, the boarding schools were highly disciplined. They were modeled after the military, as every facet of student life followed a strict timetable. And so students who violated the rules were sometimes punished, including by physical means. So, as the slide says, a normal day in the life of a child at one of these boarding schools would be first religious instruction, and by that I mean, instruction in Christianity. 2, industrial training and agricultural labor. 3, rudimentary English or basic academic skills. So religious instruction, industrial training, or agricultural labor, and then also rudimentary academic skills, including rudimentary English. So Native American children had to give up their native ways of dressing and cut their hair. Most schools required that students wear uniforms. Girls' long black hair was cut short or bobbed or twisted in the fashion of the day for, an American society. The girls had to abandon their native cultural attire to wear stiff starched collars, stockings, black oxfords, and pinafores. So here is, right, this is an example of a man who, this is the supposed before picture, and this is the after picture. You can see here what it looks like for the before-after for Zuni children in New Mexico. This is what they look like before, and then they're stripped of their native cultural attire in this after picture. So the schools often focused more on the girls' dress, their posture, their comportment, and hairstyles, more than they did the Indian boys, revealing a racially defined perception of Indian peoples' physical bodies as quote-unquote uncivilized. It's also important to remember that the girls, right, are scrutinized more than the boys because girls and then women are seen as carriers of culture, and so you have to strip the women of their cultural attire and their customs so that they don't pass down the culture to their children, their native cultural traditions and attire to their children. So this was actually Tom Torlino, a Navajo. This is what he looked like when he arrived at the Carlisle Indian boarding school in 1882, and this is supposedly what he looked like 3 years later. And I already mentioned what this photo was. So this is, these two photos show a woman named Waxy Hari. She's Cheyenne. She's pictured in her finest cultural attire in the photo to the left, and the one on the right is her Western style of dress. So, you're right, this is what she is, sort of like single and independent, but what she's supposed to be according to Western or Anglo-American norms. right? Her goal in life, as is his goal, is to get married. So students also couldn't speak. Students who couldn't speak English often faced ridicule by teachers and even their fellow native students. So some students were hit, if they were physically abused if they used their native language. And when coming to these schools, many of the children didn't actually speak any English. So the question is, if they couldn't speak their native tongue, how were they supposed to communicate with each other? So the pan-Indian uh, environment of the boarding schools encouraged the use of English, actually. So there were Hopis and Seminoles and Utes and Winnebagos, Oneidas and Ojibways, and other tribes at the same school had little alternative in many ways but to use English as their common language. So schools demanded that students abandon their tribal names and that they assume Christian names. Hence, Waikwagesig, which means dawn of the day, in Ojibwe, became John Rogers. He adopted a Christian name. So when the Flandreau boarding school opened in South Dakota in 1892, students were schooled through the 8th grade. They spent much of their half day of schooling trying to master English, and the remaining education was very elementary in nature. They were taught basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. The rest of the day was devoted to vocational training, which consisted primarily of labor at the school. In some schools in the 19th century, many of the students were forced to do agricultural labor and actually had little formal instruction, so these children are forced to labor in agriculture. Some schools taught students how to do carpentry, woodworking, and mechanical drawing. Vocational training for schools consisted of training almost exclusively in domestic science, so i.e. cooking, sewing, taking care of kids, and that sort of thing. They were not taught other kinds of labor. In fact, by 1900, many school administrators had come to feel that Native Americans were incapable of learning more than the basics. So reading, basic math, because the place, they said that the place of Indians was not to become doctors or lawyers, but it was to become tradespeople, agricultural workers and domestics. So women in general in the U.S. in the 19th century and throughout much of the 20th century received an education that emphasized domesticity above all. But for Native American girls, this domestic training was meant to train them in subservience and submission to authority. Native American girls worked in the sewing room, they did laundry, they cooked, they served food in the dining room, and they kept the dormitories clean. Many girls also had to take care of the teachers' rooms, so they weren't just in school, they were doing the labor of the school. They were taught things like how the proper method for making a bed. And the Indian schools, these boarding schools, suffered from a lack of funds, and so found themselves relying on student labor whenever possible. So some Indian girls did end up as domestic workers after they left the schools, right, working in the homes of white families primarily. But the training of Indian girls in domesticity served, I would say, an ideological purpose in addition to the practical function. So one author argues that the practical details of needlework, laundry, and food preparation in the school training of girls was less important than their training in acquiescence to authority, to federal authority, to the authority of white families. And so Indian girls were taught that they were supposed to be the uplifters of Indian home life. They were trained to do household labor so that they could run Christian civilized homes that encouraged their children, their husbands and their children, to adopt Anglo-American customs and abandon their own Native American customs. Through the instructional program then, Native Americans were not being assimilated to resemble white Americans, but rather were being assimilated into a very clear racial hierarchy in the United States, one in which they were clearly at the bottom. So in the 1930s, the Indian boarding schools would be criticized for their use of child labor. There was also something called the outing program during the summer. Children would be sent out to work for wages during the summer, either to learn a skill or because their parents couldn't afford to take care of them, and the school wasn't taking care of them. So, the outing program for Native American children meant that they were sent to work as servants in white homes over the summer. The idea of placing girls among white families was to learn by association. White women who agreed to take in Indian girls became part of this project of teaching them that there was one proper form of femininity and that their native traditions were somehow bad. They also, right, white women in these families, they also taught the Native American girls their proper place in the racial hierarchy was below white women. So the conditions of the housing for the boarding schools was often run down and overcrowded. Children had very little privacy, for the most part, having to sleep in large dormitories. And sometimes, due to overcrowding, students had to sleep two to a bed. It was common for students to be hit for breaking the rules. I already mentioned that students who spoke their native language instead of English could be abused. But students were also made to, they could be hit, but students were also made to do things like wash their mouths out with soap. They were sometimes stuffed into dark closets. And sexual abuse was also a problem by teachers. And as they got older, some of the older students, having learned, right, having been abused themselves, would then molest the younger children. So there was a cycle of sexual violence that started in the schools, continued in the schools, and was even brought from these schools to Native communities. At the schools, diseases flourished. Many students contracted serious illnesses because of the overcrowding, the poor conditions. They contracted illnesses like the flu, tuberculosis, measles. Numbers are unknown about how many children died while at the schools, but there were many. At the cemetery at the Haskell boarding school, for instance, tombstones indicated that people from 37 tribes had died while there. I should say children from 37 tribes had died while there. So the Ojibways were buried next to Hopis and Seminoles alongside Cheyennes. But of course, students and parents attempted, sometimes successfully, to resist the conditions at the boarding schools. Parents and other guardians wrote letter upon letter to school officials threatening to inform their superiors of the abuses. They registered complaints with government agents on the reservations, and they reported incidents of mistreatment to the Indian office in Washington, D.C. And students also tried to rebel by running away, the same way, right, that we talked about enslaved people running away to resist their own enslavement, or the conditions of slavery. So Native American girls resisted the regimentation of the schools in other ways. Since the schools were sex segregated, the girls practiced solidarity as they shared risks and protected one another and tried to assert their individual identities. Okay, so we're coming to the end. There's some reforms that I wanted to talk about that get implemented in the 1930s, and they start with the Meriam Report, which was published in 1928. It was an expose about Native American conditions in the United States. And in addition to describing poverty on reservations, it also discussed the poor conditions at the Indian boarding schools. And the attention received by the report resulted in some school reforms. The government, for instance, started to spend more money on the boarding schools after the Meriam Report. So John Collier, who was appointed commissioner of what we now call the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1933, he was appointed under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He would remain in this position until 1945, and he was convinced that Native Americans had been treated unfairly. So he said that there wasn't enough food provided to the children, that there's evidence that children had lost weight while at the boarding schools. He also criticized the schools for their emphasis on manual labor rather than academic instruction. And as a result, a number of the schools closed. Dozens were converted to day schools from being residential boarding schools. But that left a couple dozen off-reservation boarding schools in operation. So even if, there were these reforms, the boarding schools did not disappear entirely. Collier also launched what was called the Indian New Deal. He increased spending not only on the schools but on Indian health care. He successfully secured the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act, which was passed in 1934, which reversed, and this is really key, the Dawes Act's privatization of Indian communally held lands. So he basically reversed the Dawes Act, but that doesn't mean that people got land back. It just means that their land was not taken from them anymore to be divided up among individuals. So there was a return to local self-governance on a tribal basis. The act did not, it encouraged economic self-sufficiency, but like I said, it did not restore land that had already been sold to non-Indians. The Indian New Deal marked the most radical shift in Indian policy in the nation's history, but it did not seriously deal with poverty on Indian reservations, and thus poverty is still, very prevalent among Native American reservations and Native American people in general. So the Indian boarding schools reached their peak between 1890 and 1910. There were around 60 Indian boarding schools in operation, with Native American girls making up between 40 to 50% of the student body. And like I said, they were never fully abandoned. By 1941, there were 14,000 Native students who resided and studied at the boarding schools still in operation. And the Indian boarding schools had a long-term effect on Native American identity. So in her book, Boarding School Seasons by Brenda C. Child, a member of the Ojibwe tribe whose grandmother attended an Indian boarding school, and that's why she wrote this book, to understand her grandmother's experiences. So Brenda C. Child says, quote, "In the process of attending these schools, Indians became more alike. They learned bits of each other's languages, and everyone learned English. Graduates married into other tribes. Summer celebrations on reservations became increasingly intertribal. New political alliances were formed, and for better or worse, the schools became part of our histories. The Indian girls who left the boarding schools were generally not trained to attain a range of jobs. For instance, if a girl elected to live within the white community, about the only job available to her was that of domestic work." So to conclude, I'll just repeat the two arguments main ideas that I started the lecture with. So the federal boarding schools had as their purpose to not assimilate Native American children into a so-called American melting pot, but rather train them in the work discipline of the Protestant ethic and to accept their proper place in society as a marginal class. The federal government's project of sending children to Indian boarding schools was a key way that the U.S. government tried to force Indians not only to assimilate, but to be positioned at the bottom of a racialized and gendered hierarchy within U.S. society. And I also argue that Native American girls were forced to learn how to act according to Victorian era, i.e. 19th century white ideals of femininity, in a way that was very much shaped by race.